Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the third Eltham Hill Debates. Thank you everyone who's joining us this lunchtime. And the motion that we're going to be discussing today is this House supports a fully renewable energy grid. And we've got a couple of students here, as well as an active staff member and two guest speakers who are going to be battling it out to decide on the fate of this motion. Before we begin, I'm going to explain how we're going to run the debate and a couple of rules, and I will also be announcing the result of our poll. So you can see that you can vote in that poll. We've got most people have voted already. I've got about half of the attendees who are with us have already voted. So have a little think. And the aim of the debate today will be for our speakers to move people from one side to the other. And that's how we decide the winners. There's no judging, there's no feedback, it's just voting. A reminder that today's debate will be recorded and it will be uploaded onto YouTube as well. We've had a really strong attendance to our live sessions, but even more people have watched it afterwards. So welcome as well to all those people who are joining us on the Eltham Hill YouTube for what we think should be a really, really fantastic debate. So we're going to have a team in proposition today, and we're going to have three speakers on that team. And we're going to have two speakers actually today on opposition. Normally we would have three, but sadly one of our students hasn't been able to join us for technical reasons. So Eva's going to step up and do what we call in debating an Iron Man, which is where you have to do two speeches in the same debate. It's quite common in debating competitions when we have dropouts or we have illnesses. So Eva has actually been asked to do that last minute. So her summary speech might not be as long as others, but thank you, Eva, for stepping up and taking that on. We're also today going to have a Q&A session. So as you can see, there's a Q&A function that you can use, and I want you throughout the debate to add your questions to that Q&A, and I will read those out if you have any questions. And it will be the job of the summary speakers to respond to those questions when we get to the floor. So you can actually add those at any point. You don't need to add it when we get to the floor debate, but it'd be helpful if we could have some questions for the summary speakers to chew on. There's one other housekeeping aspect that you'll need to be aware of, which is today's debate does include points of information. Now that's when speakers can interrupt the person who is currently making their speech. Speakers will be able to unmute themselves and say point of information, or they can do the hand sign if they want. And it'll be up to the person speaking to accept or decline those points of information. Points of information should be kept to about 10 seconds really. And if they go on and on and on, I can just mute them, which I will do. Okay, so, and then it's up to the speaker to try and respond on their feet straight away to that. So I'll give you about 30 more seconds to respond to the poll. And whilst you do that, I'll introduce our first speaker, who is Mr. Scott Ralston. He was the chief adjudicator, which means chief judge of the World Schools Debating Competitions. So he's judged at the highest level in debating. He's also the coach of public speaking and debating for the Oxford Union, and as well as the coach for the national team of the UAE and Scotland. He's also a winner of the World Masters University Debating Championships and have reached 10 other finals. So we couldn't have a better speaker to open the case for the proposition. I'm now going to end that poll and share the results. This is the job that we have for us. It's actually fairly tight, which means that this is going to be really, really interesting to see the results. We've got 45% of you agree, 36% of you disagree, and 18% of you have declared yourselves up for grabs. You are unsure. So you're going to be asked to vote again at the end. So whilst you're listening, think about whether or not you still agree or disagree. So with that, I would like to say that the motion before the House is this House supports a fully renewable energy grid. Scott, you've got 3 minutes on the clock. I will unmute you. Take it away.
Thank you very much. So having been stuck at home for the last 7 weeks, I've been doing a lot of reflection. I've been looking out at London with clear blue skies. I've been doing my daily walk instead of my usual rush to the tube, with cleaner, fresher air. And that's led me to think and have a greater understanding and respect for what's outside instead of what's inside. So that's why on Proposition, we are supporting a fully renewable energy grid. So what do we mean by that? In terms of our definition, we mean that currently the energy grid is made up of a number of different ways, often involving fossil fuels. So looking at oil, coal and gas. What we support is moving to a fully renewable grid involving wind, solar or water power or variations of those different types to make sure that they're all sustainable in order to power the nation and to protect our lungs and to protect our climate. And because ultimately we recognise that the Earth's future matters just a bit more than immediate gain for us. What we're not going to do is do this immediately. We're happy to roll it in over time so that people are still able to have access to power as time goes on. But in the end, over at least the next 50 years, we want renewable power to be what is powering our grid. So I'm going to be looking at why it is that our climate is unique. Because ultimately, we've been isolating in our homes. And at some point, we'll be able to go outside again. But when you think about it in the long term, we're isolated to this planet. And when we look at emissions from power plants, not just in the UK, but also across the world, we see the degree to which they pollute our environment. The skies, the air, our lungs. And this causes long-lasting damage. We can see that the use of coal, gas, oil is depleting our ozone layer. It's melting our ice caps, and it's leading to climate change. And why is this bad? You just need to look around the world over the last year to see the flooding and tornadoes and hurricanes that have hit the eastern seaboard of North America. You just need to look at the typhoons that have caused havoc in the Philippines and across Southeast Asia, causing ultimate harm to some of the most vulnerable people on this planet. You just need to think about the fact that in 50 years, at the rate we're going at, Bangladesh will be underwater. You can just look at the deadly bushfires in California or in North America. So ultimately, this is a result of our actions and our choices. And at the moment, our choices are to use oil, to use gas, and use coal to try and power all of the things that we like. We can change that. So when you look at renewable sources, we're using nature at its finest instead of abusing nature at our worst. So what we are able to do is use the sun that comes out every day. We can use the rivers that we've got. We can use the tides. We can use so many natural features that we've got to try and deal with this to make sure that we're able to work on a sustainable way. Babs, I'll take you.
Thank you. Isn't there a middle ground that incorporates nuclear energy at some point?
Well, ultimately not, because nuclear energy means that you need to get rid of the nuclear waste. So you cannot be helping the planet by stopping pollution in the air when you're just dumping radioactive materials into the earth. Because ultimately, that all feeds around in the same way. If anyone watched Chernobyl in the last year, you just need to see the damage that something going wrong by a rogue state can do to the earth and to the people around it. And yes, safety features can be in place, but you still need to get rid of that nuclear reactive waste somewhere, and ultimately that is still going to harm the earth. So that's something which we don't stand for on Proposition. What we prefer is to use what's natural to the earth, what's natural to our resources, in order to make sure that the earth is protected. And we've got a once in a lifetime opportunity for this, because if we don't act now, it will only get worse. Ice caps will melt faster, which means there will be more heat in the air. That means that you won't get the cooling effects that happen or the effects that you properly get of the Gulf Stream or various other natural mechanisms to try and regulate the planet and regulate what's happening in our environment. So ultimately, we need to act now. We can't move to a different home. We need to stick with this one. We need to respect it and not abuse it. So we should use its full resources and over time move to a fully renewable grid. And that's why I'm very happy to stand on side Proposition.
Great, thank you very much. Big virtual round of applause there for Scott for opening up the debate. Also like to thank our guest speaker for offering a point of information. Always good to see a little bit of back and forth, so I encourage all speakers to continue that as we go through. Right, now I'm going to hand over to our first speaker from the opposition, who is Eva in Year 10. Eva, I'm going to unmute you. You've got about 3 minutes on the clock. Take it away.
Hi, my name is Eva. Today I'll be opposing the motion this House supports a fully renewable energy grid. First, I'd like to address that you mentioned nuclear adding fumes to the climate, but biomass is another form of renewable energy which, when burned, actually releases carbon dioxide. Team opposition recognises the effect of climate change, but the motion says fully. It is simply impossible to move towards a fully renewable energy grid. I'd like to draw your attention to the flaws with the system. There's no denying that the renewable energy grid does a lot of good, but how sustainable is it in the long term? Wind turbines are not only costly and bad for the environment, but take up a lot of land. Studies by Harvard showed that meeting current electricity needs using wind power would take up 12% of continental US. Bearing in mind, wait, what?
Except.
Yeah, except.
How do wind farms harm the environment?
Because they take up a lot of land, and they also, the noise, it's not just about like, yes, the noise as well. Also, the reliability is an issue as it's not always windy and always sunny in all parts of the planet. Furthermore, wind turbines are extremely expensive, costing in the millions to create. Another upcoming source of renewable energy is biomass, which is the burning of dead trees and plants, which when plants die, they have stores of carbon in them. So when they burn, that carbon is released into the atmosphere. It also increases the price. Renewable energy is a lot more costly. For instance, California's solar electric generating system takes up 3,500 acres to produce 392 megawatts of energy, unlike a natural gas, which is a postage-sized comparison, producing 1,633 megawatts, meaning that
point
it's more
of information.
Except.
So you talked about Hinkley Point, about nuclear. That cost us, or is costing us £21.5 billion. And if you look at the cost of energy, in fact, for renewables, it is gradually decreasing. So the average cost of wind is between $30 and $60 compared to coal, or which can go up to $143. So the cost for renewables is actually less.
Yeah, but it's gradually and it's over time. But at the moment, people, if we were doing it, people would still have to pay more if you think about it now in regards to like in the future. As well as this, developing countries don't always have the resources to move towards a renewable energy grid. Because they don't have that much money, it could cause potentially in the future black market energy, creating non-renewable resources. So it would be much more harmful to do it on the black market way, whether now it's out in the open and we can see what needs to be done and we can help minimize the damage as much as possible. I suggest that we move towards a 50% renewable energy, as you get a clear balance and you give the consumer a choice instead of forcing them into paying money that they actually can't afford. And if it's now, I understand that in the future it will get cheaper, but people are living now. People still have to pay that cost now. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm done.
Right, thank you very much, Eva, for that well-researched speech. We're now going to hand over to Aruna, who's going to speak for the opposition. She is in Year 9 and has been part of, if I'm right, the debate club this year as well. So I'm going to unmute you. You have the floor for about 3 minutes. Go.
You said that wind turbines have had low availability. However, wind turbines have improved with time and have now reached an availability of 98% and are likely to continue to improve. I've asked you to consider the relevance of renewable energy in this time. Due to the economic toll, COVID-19 has already shown that the oil industry is not a necessary sector. With its plummet and the reduced usage of cars, now is the best time to use renewable energy. Some people may argue that fossil fuels are detrimental to the function of hospitals, but actually some hospitals have shown to use renewable alternatives such as wind turbines and solar panels. Furthermore, fossil fuels do greater harm than good in terms of health and well-being during this pandemic. I say this because scientists have stated that pollution picks up the virus and is a key transmitter. Not only this, but people living in areas with high levels of pollution have high mortality rates from COVID-19. Additionally, poorer communities have poor outcomes from COVID-19. Out of necessity, many of these people live in cheap accommodations, which are often located close to sources of pollution. Whole countries can and have improved their usage of renewable energy with ease. Electricity generation from renewable sources met 44% of Turkey's total electricity demand by the end of 2019, with wind and solar energy representing around 10%, according to the statistics released by the International Renewable Energy Agency in March. Renewables accounted for 3/4 of the new capacity additions in the global power sector in 2019. Wind and solar energy, with continuing cost reductions, were the majority of them. Of course, it can be beneficial, but the main point is that renewable energy grids are clearly feasible, with Turkey's new sector being an example. I'm done. I don't know.
Great. Oh, sorry, I muted myself by accident. Thank you very much for that speech. Again, I'd like to thank all speakers so far for their well-researched contributions, and as well for including a consideration of the current climate in which this debate is happening, not just considering it in a vacuum. Just a reminder for everyone that after our next speaker, you will be able to get some answers to your questions. So I can see on the Q&A, we already have one question there that's been posted. That was in response to some points that Eva raised. Please, my challenge to every member of the audience is to type and post one question by the end of Babs's speech or afterwards. You should be able to post anonymously, and I'll give you about 30 seconds at the end of our next speaker to ask a question, and then it will be the job of our summary speakers to respond to those. Okay, I'll now turn to our second speaker on the proposition, who is Babatunde Williams, who I've been calling Babs for short. He's a public policy expert with a varied career, which began in the City of London Corporation. Since then, he's been an analyst at Chatham House and large healthcare insurance companies. He's also acted as a senior policy advisor on homelessness, street violence, and loads of other really important social issues. He's currently a partner at Purpose Union, which advises business on their social purpose work. So he's got a really wide range of expertise, which he's bringing to this debate. Right, Babs, you're unmuted and you've got 3 minutes on the clock. Take it away.
So I feel this debate comes down to three things in particular. One, is it possible to have a fully renewable grid? Two, is it cost effective in a world where we say we put aside all possibilities or impossibilities? Three, is it even clean? Is a fully renewable grid in that world, is it clean? So on the first aspect, it isn't possible. And we know it isn't possible because the IPCC, i.e. the International Panel on Climate Change, the overarching body which manages energy around the world and energy relationships around the world, in 2012 published a study saying that a fully renewable grid was the long-term aim for every single government, and it was possible. Within 2 years, they released another study saying that actually it wasn't possible. Now, why is this the case? Because, for instance, if I give you an example, you have an energy grid in Britain. It's sunny one day and it's not sunny at night and it's not sunny the next day. How do you then power the homes in that country if your energy grid is totally dependent on, let's say, solar power to a large extent? Now imagine, no thank you. Now imagine also there isn't any wind and there's minimal sunlight. Well, the opposition are probably going to say, well, we can depend on hydro. Well, also what the IPCC found in 2014 is that hydro capacity around the world is rapidly decreasing. And also the British government does a hydro study annually, which they've also found there is no more hydro capacity to put on to add to the British grid. In other words, we're at our max hydro capacity. We can't add any more forms of energy to which we can't actually predict.
Information.
Go for it.
Why can't we use waves? Do you think they're going to stop as well?
Okay, so tidal energy only gives you a limited amount of energy. It's not necessarily as well tested as hydro, and it's not necessarily as effective as offshore wind. So the IPCC have found those things and have then come to the second conclusion, which brings me on to the question is it clean? Well, they've decided that as a result of renewable energies being intermittent, i.e. they go up and down depending on whether there's sunlight, whether there's any wind, so on and so forth, it then relies on gas. So in Britain, that requires a 33% backup of gas to support renewable energy when there isn't any wind and when there isn't any sunlight and as hydro is decreasing. In places like Canada, Ontario, that requires a 74% backup of gas to support renewable energies on the grids, which means it isn't even possible to have 100% renewable grid, one. And two, even when you do have it, you have to back it up with fossil fuels anyway, meaning that it actually isn't clean. And then at what cost? So we heard that renewables are actually really cheap, i.e. they've been going down in price. Well, the prices that are quoted for nuclear is the front end cost, i.e. a nuclear power plant will then last you for 50 years, and contemporary power plants can be refitted at will again and again. Now, a wind power plant, if you look at the cost of wind...
Point of information.
Go for it.
Okay, according to the French Environment and Energy Management Agency, so France is one of the top nuclear producing countries in the world. They rely on 75% of their nuclear energy. They said 100% renewable energy would have the same costs to maintaining nuclear energy. So nuclear, if you are to maintain it, has the same costs according to that
So
agency.
France are currently positing something that I call it has never been done, and they're telling us that in this imaginary world, this is what would be the case. Now, in the real world which we live in, i.e. the current state of play, France has a 94% decarbonized grid. They are cleaner than practically every single country in the world. Now, how do they do that? As Mr. Bishop has already told us, they do it by having a 75% nuclear grid. So that's great. We should just do that, right? If the end is to have a decarbonized grid, we already have a country that's a great example. Instead of a wishy-washy example, i.e. 100% renewables, which most engineers and climate scientists now say isn't even possible. Great. And so then the question is, at what cost? Sorry, I got interrupted there. Then the problem with renewables is that you look at it and you say they're cheap as and when I'm buying it, but they don't currently account for backup costs, i.e. the gas that you require to back up and support them. They don't currently account for the battery power. Now, bearing in mind, the largest battery in the world, the Escondido battery, can only charge the American grid for 4 hours at a time and costs approximately, I think, $1.5 trillion to do so for those 4 hours. The cost of battery power to support renewables on the grid at present is practically an insurmountable price that it's just not possible. Now, what has this led to? In Britain, this has led to around 40 to 50,000 people being put in fuel poverty in the last 10 years, on an annual basis, according to the government library, the parliamentary library. So in essence, what we have is a high cost, something that isn't even clean because it depends on fossil fuels to back it up. And finally, ultimately, and most importantly, it isn't even possible. So yeah.
Great, thank you very much, Babs, for that impassioned speech. I'd like to thank all speakers for their use of evidence. I think there's been a lot of reports and a lot of evidence used by all the speakers, and it'll be up to you guys in the audience, remember, to weigh up that evidence and consider it when you make your votes at the end. Right, I'm going to ask some of the questions that have been coming through on our Q&A. Thank you to those who have submitted them. If you haven't submitted one yet, you have about 30 seconds to ask a question. I'm sure that Babs's speech may have raised some. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question to Eva first, because you're going to have to step in last minute. You mentioned something in your speech about the black market and having to rely on some kind of black market for energy supply. The question here is, how do you get energy from the black market? Are there particular areas that might be at risk? Could you just explain that point a little bit more for our audience? We then have, and I think this might be a good question to pose actually to both summary speakers. We have a question from Deborah, which is, what's the biggest risk associated with non-renewable energy sources? So both Eva and Mr. Bishop, I want you to battle that out. So Eva, what's the biggest risk associated with non-renewable energy sources? Oh, sorry, yes, it is Isabella from 7T who made the first question. She'd also like to know what are backup costs? And Babs, I actually might ask you to respond to that before we move on. So Babs, could you just explain what backup costs are?
So a backup cost is basically, like, for instance, at points where you do not have any wind or you don't have any solar, the renewables, when you calculate renewables, I'm just calculating the cost of me buying wind in that moment. I'm not calculating the fact that the government have in papers saying that they need 30% backup, i.e. if there's no wind, I need to now turn on gas or coal at a very fast pace, something that I can burn almost immediately. And as a result of that, that transitional energy towards getting energy to your grid, for instance, let's imagine you're at home and you turn on the gas. It needs to be something that just comes on like that. And those sorts of energy sources are usually fossil fuels. So when there's no wind, the backup will be fossil fuels, almost certainly. That's something that's accepted. And then the backup cost is the cost of having that backup. So for every pound you spend on a renewable here in Britain, it's around 33 pence. I personally think that's a very conservative estimate.
Great. Thank you, Baz, for that explanation. I hope that was clear for everyone in the audience. Okay, so we have another question here for the proposition, which is, how do you suggest that countries with governments that are unsupportive of renewable energy become 100% renewable? So those countries that maybe are a little bit not maybe as far along in terms of their infrastructure, how are we going to make sure that they move to a renewable system? Okay, one from Ms. Sabic. Would you be prepared to pay a lot more for your energy bills in order to achieve this motion? If so, it's quite a direct question for Mr. Bishop. How much? How much are you willing to pay, Mr. Bishop? We want a figure. Okay, so, and the final one is, how does renewable energy help the environment? So a little bit more explanation on why. So maybe some repetition of the points made earlier by Scott. Why is it that actually a renewable energy grid is going to help the environment? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to allow our summary speakers to just prepare for a moment while I explain how this one works. So we're actually going to switch the order here. So Eva actually has to go first. And the reason for that is the proposition is often a more challenging job in a debate than an opposition, because it might be easier to poke holes in something than to propose something. So Eva's going to go first. A reminder that Eva did not know until 1 o'clock this afternoon that she was going to have to make a speech. One of my favourite questions actually in our Q&A today is, hi, where did the people find the time to do this webinar? Well, they didn't have a lot of time to prepare, and nor did Eva for this summary speech. So Eva, you've got 3 minutes on the clock, but if you could just respond to some of those questions, that would be really, really great. I will unmute you, go for it.
Okay, so what was meant by the black market was, in developing countries, a lot of their governments are corrupt, and by making renewable energy like non-renewable energy moving not legal, or obviously it not being approved, black markets could occur with gaps in the government and inconsistencies where governments just decide not to obey to renewable energy, and they basically just create their own energy sources of non-renewable energy. And I think the other question was, what was the biggest non-renewable energy effect, I think? And I'd say it's team opposition. We're not trying to say that non-renewable energy is good. We're just moving towards a 50% split. And there is a lot of effects of non-renewable energy. It's obviously really, really bad for the environment. But if we go to a 50-50 split, it would be a lot more achievable than fully renewable. So yeah, I'm done, I think.
Great, thank you for responding to some of those questions. Okay, right, after Mr. Bishop has made a speech, we're going to go back to voting. So it is time to start to make your decisions. And we have one final speaker to sway you, which is Mr. Bishop, who's a geography teacher who's passionate about the environment and climate change. Take it away.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify. Am I answering the questions or do the questions first?
You can answer them in either order. You can answer straight away, or you can answer them at the end.
All right. Yeah, I mean, so I was just going to tackle a few of these questions because I think it's really important that we clarify some of the things that may be slightly debatable. So just initially, Isabella, how does renewable energy help the environment? Really, it is the only way forward for our planet, because at the moment we're producing a lot of greenhouse gases, and those greenhouse gases are trapping radiation from the sun, and our world is over time getting much warmer. So we need renewables because they rely on natural forms of energy, so running water for hydroelectric, or the sun, energy coming from the sun, or the wind. Those have no carbon emissions in terms of their energy production, and so that it's much better for our planet because there's less heat being trapped. I was going to also go, there was a question about going to different countries where they can't necessarily access that, the infrastructure might not be there. Actually, in a lot of developing countries, which we mentioned, renewable energy is better for them. So they have capacity for things like solar. So if you think about sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't have to be a massive energy grid. It can be localized production, so on a small scale. And this is my issue with the debate, is that big companies want you to believe that it is far too expensive. They want you to believe that we cannot do it. Okay, I'm just going to go to a quote by Professor Timmons, who's a professor of economics in America. He said, "Fully renewable electric grids are feasible with current technology and current prices. Barriers to renewable are more political and cultural." Okay, now, Babs, I'll come back to some of your points. You were talking about we can do it now. Okay, if we invest in these technologies now, I know that it's not possible to do it now, but in the future, all of those costs, all of those barriers that we initiated, those will be overcome, because as you invest in technologies, the capacity and the cost of things decreases, and so they become more viable. Okay, you mentioned being able to store, so the energy. In the last 7 years, energy storage has gone down by 79%. Okay, and that's only in 7 years, so we're talking about long term, not right now. But the most important thing is that we need to think about sustainable things, not just for the environment, but for people. The poorest people, so we talked about what are the biggest costs. The worst impacts are that the poorest people around the world are going to be even worse off. They're going to be poorer, they're going to be left to cope with climates that we cannot cope with. And we have made a commitment as a country. The Paris Agreement, by law, says we have to meet these targets. So it's not okay for us to go, oh, well, we just need to carry on or as we are. The economic and social costs are far too much, and we need to make sure we commit to these targets, and we can do it. Just big businesses, governments might not want you to believe that it is possible. Okay, we've seen through the recent COVID outbreaks that people can reduce the amount of consumption, and they can get to work by cycling and much better and more environmentally friendly needs. So I don't think this House should just say we support it. I think we demand it rather than anything else. So that's where I'm at.
Great, thank you, Mr. Bishop. So you avoided the question there of how much money you'd be willing to pay. Like an excellent.
Just come back. I do pay. So I do pay for 100% renewable, and I'm aware that that isn't actually 100% renewable in terms of where it comes from, but I'm prepared to pay the extra. Thank you, Ms. Hubbick.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Thank you for that response. Really good. Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for their speeches on this debate. It is now time for you as an audience to make a decision. I urge you not to go with unsure. I want you to try and weigh up what you've heard. Think about the quality of the speeches that you've heard. Think about the evidence that our speakers have presented to you as you vote in this poll. Think as well about how they convey themselves, their use of persuasive language, their structure. Take all of that into account, because this isn't just about facts and statistics, it's about emotions, and we can take those into account as well. So almost all of us have voted, very quick votes there. And I could do a drum roll, but I won't. In that poll. The result is pretty clear, win for the proposition. So agree 73%, disagree 21%, commiserations to the oil companies represented by Babs and Eva. I'm sure you've got some jobs there in PR, in the future. So that remains for me to thank everyone who came to watch this live, as well as everyone who's joined us on YouTube. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your engagement. I'd also like to especially thank our students, Eva and Aruna, for their brilliant speeches and taking the time to prepare those for us today. And finally, a big thank you to Mr. Bishop, who's been very busy teaching as well as preparing for this, as well as our guest speakers, Mr. Babs Williams and Scott Ralston, for your expert opinions and debating skills, which have been on show for everyone today. So this debate is now kind of concluded. There's a challenge for all year 10s to write your own speech for this and send it in to your English teachers if you've become inspired to engage with that, and we will provide you with feedback. Next Thursday, we will be debating US politics. Never a better time to do it. So please join us for that session as well, and stay safe. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.